Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Joshua Rubenstein. Mr. Rubenstein was on the staff of Amnesty International USA from 1975 to 2012 as the Northeast Regional Director. He is currently Senior Advisor to the organization. He's also a longtime associate of the Davis Center for Russian and Euro-Asian Studies at Harvard University. After graduating from Columbia University, where he studied philosophy and Russian, he moved to Jerusalem for a year, teaching English to Israelis. He moved to Boston in 1972 and taught Hebrew school, writing in his spare time. He met his wife in the US, who is also a Wellesley graduate, in 1972. He's the author of Soviet Dissidents, The Struggle for Human Rights and Tangled Loyalties, The Life and Time of Ilya Ehrenberg, a biography of the controversial Soviet Jewish writer and journalist. His latest book is Leon Trotsky, published in October 2011. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Rubenstein.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank the Institute for inviting me out here this January. I've participated in other programs the last few years, and so I'm very happy to be with you. I understand you were given at least one paper to read as a kind of introduction to the topic of humanitarian intervention, and perhaps you've had time to poke around the library or the internet and find some other material. I'd like to spend a little time introducing the subject and then get into the meat of the question, and by then I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions and objections and issues to raise. But let me say first a few words of introduction and why I chose as the title Linking Human Rights with the Challenge of Humanitarian Intervention. When the human rights movement emerged after World War II and the founding of the United Nations, the human rights movement was responding to both the evils of the war, the terrible violence of the war and the Holocaust, and what we all knew was happening in Eastern Europe under the Stalinist regimes. So there was an urge to create an international order, an organization that would somehow stand up for these values, for democratic values, and nurture them throughout the world. So when you read about the origins of the United Nations and you read the UN Charter, it does talk about the need to preserve the peace, but there's very explicitly language relating to human rights. That the UN did see itself as an organization that would promote human rights, promote respect for human rights around the world. And this reached its most explicit, substantial expression in the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on December 10th, 1948, by the General Assembly. At that time, I think there were 56 member countries of the UN. So it looked very different than it does today. Today there are, I think, 194 member countries. Much of the world was still colonies, especially in Africa, some in Asia. The Soviet Union was one unitary state. It was not broken up into many different countries as we have today. So the world looked very different from an international point of view. But I'd like to point out that if on December 10th the UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was not unanimously, several states abstained, like the Soviet Union and its allies, I believe South Africa and Saudi Arabia, but you can check the details. The day before, on December 9th, 1948, the Convention on the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide was adopted unanimously by the UN General Assembly. So in these two succeeding days, December 9th, December 10th, the UN adopted these two foundational documents, barely 3 years into its existence, that gave expression to some kind of determination, some kind of commitment to stand up for human rights, to identify human rights as a foundational value for this new international system and for the United Nations generally. Now, all that's very nice. We look to these documents for guidance, or maybe sometimes we try to ignore those documents when it's too embarrassing. But they're there. One of the main problems, and there's a whole history here, but one of the main problems of these documents, in particular the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is that it did not come with any machinery to enforce it. Now, I want to give you a trivial example of what we mean when we say to enforce a law. We live here in Boston, in the Boston area. We know that there are stop signs on our street corners and traffic lights on our corners, and people are given instructions about how to drive and cross the street. And what if one day we realize there's been a rash of accidents, that people are not obeying the law, and we're seeing children be hurt or killed, we're seeing pedestrians being injured. And so the city council goes to the police and says, well, you got to do something about it. And the police says, yeah, we know what's on the books governing how people drive and how they should not jaywalk, but there's nothing we can do about it. We don't have the funds, we don't have the officers, and we don't even have the political will to, enforce these traffic laws. So yes, it's very sad all this is happening, but, there's nothing we can do. Now, that's a trivial example. We know it doesn't happen that way in our communities. But imagine on a grand scale something similar. We know terrible things happen around the world. You just have to look at your newspapers or a news website. There are very few examples in the modern world in recent decades where something terrible was going on and we did not know about it in real time. There are very few examples of that. We at least suspect when something is going on, and when we're not allowed to get closer to it, that usually confirms our suspicion. And given the kind of information technology we have today, where everyone is a cameraman, everyone is carrying a camera because it's on their phone, there's virtually nothing that is really secret when it comes to this scale of violence or repression. So if in previous decades people could say, well, we didn't know, we only learned about it 6 months later when the mail arrived, or we only learned about it when some journalist or a refugee was able to escape, or a diplomat was able to come out and tell us what's really happening in one country or another. All of those excuses no longer apply. In fact, we do know. That's one thing. Now, when the human rights community emerged as a group of organizations, and I'll use the example I know best, Amnesty International, when we were founded in the early 60s, we had a very ambitious, though some might say modest, agenda we set for ourselves. We were going to learn the identity of individual prisoners. We were going to document the use of torture and the death penalty, the mistreatment of refugees, and campaign for the victims. We were very clear we were never going to ask for intervention. And intervention is a euphemism I'll talk about in a minute. We were never going to say, you need to send helicopters here, and we'll avoid sending helicopters there. You know, the American expression, where do you send the cavalry, right? We all grew up watching Westerns, and all the good guys are waiting for the cavalry to arrive to save whoever needs saving from the robbers or whoever's threatening them, right? That was not our job. Our job was to say how bad things were and to campaign through letter writing, through demonstrations on behalf of the victims. But as the 1960s wore on into the 1970s, we began learning about, and I don't mean just Amnesty, the whole world, learning about such desperate situations. So take Cambodia between 1970 1975, under the Khmer Rouge, the years that coincided with the end of the Vietnam War, where the U.S. was conducting this war in Vietnam. Khmer Rouge took over, and they killed perhaps as many as 2 million of their own people. It wasn't one group killing another group. It was Cambodians killing Cambodians. There was a dispute about the level of destruction and violence because Their diplomats were kicked out, journalists were kicked out. Some people didn't want to believe it could be happening. And of course, the international community had no way of even imagining how it would intervene. The U.S. had been bombing Cambodia illegally during the Vietnam War, not informing Congress. The U.S. was doing what it could to get out of Vietnam. It was a protracted problem. We won't discuss that today. But finally, the U.S. left, or depending on your point of view, was expelled. And then all of a sudden you have this terrible conflict in Cambodia and level of violence. No one discussed intervening until the Vietnamese invaded. And whatever you think of that invasion, it brought an end to the genocide. That's simply a fact. In Central Africa and Uganda, you had the regimes of Idi Amin and Milton Obote. Estimates are that perhaps 500,000 people were killed. Do we call it genocide? Do we need to call it genocide? There's no question that the scale was atrocious. It only came to an end when Tanzania invaded. For a variety of reasons, Tanzania invaded and brought an end. At that point, I believe Obote was in power, not Idi Amin, and brought an end to that period of Ugandan history. So I'll end this brief introduction with a bit of it's not really a story, just something that happened to me, where I was hearing the British scholar Martin Gilbert lecture here in Boston once, and he posed a question to the audience after discussing the Holocaust and other dreadful situations in the 20th century. He said, how do you bring an end to genocide? And I whispered, kind of half out loud, you invade. Sounds easy, right? Sounds simple. Because if you name a genocide, it never ends when they run out of victims. It ends because a superior force, for one reason or another, intervenes. Nazi Germany was defeated. It was defeated. It didn't just decide to become Bermuda one day. Now, the mass violence in the Soviet Union ended when Stalin died. And his successors disavowed that level of terror very explicitly. But in every example you can think of really mass killing and atrocity, it ended when someone of superior force intervened. I think that's one thing to just look at. Whether we agree with the intervention or not, you should look at those examples. So let's get back to the human rights movement. When the human rights movement documents what happened in Chechnya in the 1990s, when Russia was at war with some of its own people, the Chechens are Russian citizens, Soviet citizens and citizens of the Russian Federation. When you have the violence we see by China in Tibet, and you can name many other situations, where does the question of intervention arise? And where do we know it will never arise? Because some states are simply too powerful. And it's one thing to intervene in a weaker state that's carrying out these kinds of violations, rather than imagine going to a general war with Russia or China, which are extreme examples. Now, when a group like Amnesty comes to a problem like this, and people say, but you never give a policy recommendation. For example, Amnesty does not ever advocate boycotts. People say, well, shouldn't we boycott the Moscow Olympics? Remember in 1980, Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan at the end of 1979. The Olympics were scheduled to be in Moscow in 1980. And Jimmy Carter, who was our president, said, well, we're going to boycott the Moscow Olympics. Amnesty doesn't take that position because, we just reported on 150 different countries. Are we going to boycott 150 different countries? That's not, No one. That's not realistic. No one would take you seriously. So what formula do you have if you're a human rights organization that says you will apply your human rights standards and as a result you will boycott this country or that country with the hope that that will protect human rights? Is that a simple logic? So we decided we just don't have maybe somebody else will come up with that formula. We can't. So we won't advocate a boycott. What about military intervention, humanitarian intervention? Here you are, Amnesty, you're telling us how bad things are in Darfur, in Mali, since this Al-Qaeda affiliate has been taking over parts of the country, and as you know, the French have intervened this week. South Africa, under apartheid. You can name any number of situations. Amnesty's there documenting it, so why don't you say, push the button? Send in who? So again, we decided, generally speaking, we do not take that step. Our job is to provide the information. Let the Security Council sort out. Let the African Union sort it out. Let the European Union set it out. Let the US or NATO, somebody else. It's not our job. We don't have the helicopters ourselves. So the human rights community has been very reluctant to cross that point of saying, yes, you need to intervene with force. Which brings me to this phrase, humanitarian intervention. When we saw the terrible tsunami a few years ago and parts of Myanmar or Burma were devastated, the international community sent enormous amounts of aid. And we, the international community, got into a dispute with Burma because they didn't provide the aid that was being sent there for all the political reasons having to do with lack of democracy. But that didn't prevent the international community from sending aid, knowing that these regions had been so hard hit. We don't call that humanitarian intervention. When there's a famine, and unfortunately these famines do occur, and the international community is mobilized through NGOs, through the UN, through other organizations to send in food, to send in water, to send tents and medical care. We don't call that humanitarian intervention. That's an intervention of sorts. That's a provision of aid. But for some reason, I don't know the derivation, we've cooked up this euphemism, humanitarian intervention. I suppose it's meant to differentiate this kind of armed, military, violent intervention for good reasons, humanitarian reasons, in contrast to all the other reasons one country invades another, for resources, for political control, ideology, all the reasons we know are invoked, honestly or not so honestly, when one country goes to war against another. Humanitarian intervention is an armed, forceful intervention. And whenever you send in the military, before it does anything else, it's going to do two things. It's going to kill people and it's going to blow things up. That's what weapons are for. And there should never be any illusion about that. So the question is, if you're going to send in the military, someone's military, to kill people or blow things up, humanitarian intervention is a way of saying, but there's a reason you have to do it. There's a reason you have to go in to protect people who are being targeted and to go after those, whether it's the government or militias, whoever, who are carrying out these atrocities. So the word humanitarian is the cover for the use of force. And one commentator on this question has said, basically, we're going back to the theory of just war, which is a many centuries old discussion of when can you use force, when can you go to war and it's justified. I mean, if you're a pacifist, there is no discussion here. Because if you're a true pacifist, you don't recognize any legitimate reason to use force in this way. But putting that aside, are there times when you have the right to use force? If you're attacked under international law, you have the right of self-defense. Humanitarian intervention is the saying, this is not about self-defense. It's not for any selfish reason. It's not because you want the oil. It's not because there are uranium deposits. It's not because you need more land. It's because someone is hurting somewhere, and the feeling is you have the capacity to make things better. And the only way to do it is to intervene, meaning intervene with force. That basically is the outline. And it's in question that the human rights community only faces reluctantly. And we, the human rights community, is under a lot of pressure in different situations to face that. Because if you're a doctor and you diagnose something very dangerous is happening to a patient, the patient is very ill, and you're not willing to treat the patient, you'd say that doctor was being, unprofessional. Especially if the doctor, in fact, has means to do it or is thought to have means to do it. So who are you, the human rights community, to tell us something is so bad? Fill in the blank. Darfur, Mali, Chechnya, Rwanda, Cambodia, Uganda, Yugoslavia in the 1990s? Where do you draw the line? Where do you say a line has been crossed, things are so bad that we now must consider some kind of intervention from outside, a regional power, UN, Security Council? What about if you say, we'll do it as a preemptive measure? That was one of the many, many reasons that the Bush administration gave for the intervention in Iraq. That he's going to have nuclear weapons. He's a serial génocidaire. He's committed genocide on multiple occasions. All these reasons were listed, were given to the American public as a reason to intervene. So this is the broad outline, the broad challenge that both the human rights community faces and the international community as represented by the great powers who have the means to intervene if they choose to. And the dilemma all of us face is, first, there'll never be an end to these kinds of crises. Who would have thought 6 months ago that the French would be intervening in Mali? Who would have thought that? It wasn't on anybody's radar that Mali would, the sovereignty of Mali would be compromised by an al-Qaeda affiliate that would take over large portions of the country, that would try to impose Sharia law, a very extreme form of Sharia law. Who would have thought? It wasn't on anybody's radar screen. This discussion never included Mali the way it does now, this week. And when it comes to the French, given their colonial history in Africa, which is not so old because they have intervened in other cases, we'll see how this plays out. Right now, my impression is the international community has welcomed French intervention. We'll see if after a while this works, and then what happens in terms of reestablishing Mali's a stable government led by and directed by the Malian people. All those are very open questions and obviously much too early to sort out. So these are the initial problems and tensions and dilemmas that we face. Now, the institute we're part of, the Albright Institute, after all, is named after a woman who was Secretary of State during and at the United Nations doing a very difficult problem, which is the Rwanda problem. And Mrs. Albright has written about that. President Clinton has spoken about it. John Shattuck, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, has written a book on this where he discusses the Rwanda issue. That, for many people, is the quintessential case where intervention was called for and feasible. Because that's one piece of this puzzle that also has to be addressed. Not only is there a compelling reason to intervene, but can you intervene effectively? Is there a reasonable outlook, prospect that if you do intervene, that it will have the effect you're looking for, the outcome you're looking for? Looking back at the events of '94 in Rwanda, the feeling is that it would not have required that much intervention to bring an end or at least diminish the catastrophe that eventually unfolded. That seems to be the consensus, which is why President Clinton found it necessary to apologize. And he was still in office in his second term when he did. The international community, no one has ever apologized for not intervening in Chechnya. No one has ever apologized for not doing more for the Tibetan people. I mean, let's face it, we the U.S., may well, the question comes down often to, will the Dalai Lama be welcomed by the White House? And if he sees the president, will they be allowed to take a picture of him with the president? That seems to be the biggest dilemma one administration faces after another when it comes to dealing with Tibet. No one's going to intervene. No one's going to call a boycott. No one's going to declare Tibet should be independent. It's not even clear if it ever was independent. The history of Tibet is very contentious. So we're reduced to this trivial question of, okay, we'll let the Dalai Lama come and visit the president in the White House, but we will, or maybe we won't, allow him to take a picture together. That's what it comes down to when it comes to Tibet. The Chechnya, first when Yeltsin was president, and now President Putin, or is he prime minister? I get confused. Which he's chosen to be at any given time. You know, Russia supplies gas to Europe. It's part of the G8, it's part of the Security Council. It has nuclear weapons. That means it has carte blanche. It's simple as that. It has virtual carte blanche. China's second largest economic power, the most populous country on earth. I hope you all remember we did boycott China. The U.S. had no diplomatic relations with China from the time of the revolution in '49 until Nixon's visit in '72. So we tried it. You might ask yourself, what was accomplished? What was accomplished? Was China better? Was it more respectful of human rights? Did we reinforce its isolation? Or did we make its isolation all the easier? Is China better off today because of its contacts with the world, because of the thousands, hundreds of thousands of students from China studying around the world at our universities? What impact is that having? So should we go back to boycotting China or maybe intervene because of Tibet? Of course not. So humanitarian intervention comes down to, is it bad and is it a weak enough country that we can intervene and not destabilize the whole international order? Can we intervene and it won't provoke a general war? Some people in this discussion of humanitarian intervention point out that in the 1930s, before World War II, before Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, when the problem of the rise of fascism, the Nuremberg laws, the depriving of the Jews of their civil rights and civil status in Germany, but before the outright violence of the Holocaust, should the world have intervened right then? Well, it's easy to say, sure. On what legal basis? On what legal basis? there's a wonderful document you might look for. Justice Goldstone was a non-governmental commission that looked at the U.S. intervention in Kosovo under President Clinton, and Mrs. Albright was Secretary of State then at the end of the 1990s. And it was a very effective intervention in Kosovo to, I think people feel it brought an end to generally to the war in Yugoslavia. And in the end, they gave Justice Goldstone's commission gave a very ambiguous evaluation. It said it was legitimate but illegal. Now think about that for a moment. It was legitimate, meaning they had moral reasons. They were compelling moral reasons. It wasn't for any mercenary reasons, commercial, mercantile reasons. They weren't trying to gain territory. They really wanted to intervene to stop this war and stop this killing. But it had no legal basis. Did someone invite them in? Was NATO threatened? Was European stability threatened that it had to, which would be in some sense a legal reason? No. So something might be seen as legitimate by the international community if you buy the Commission's report, by its reasoning, but there's no legal basis for it. I suppose we could think of a situation where it might be legal but not legitimate, to look at it from the other point of view. Anyway, I'd like to see what questions you have now. What you've been thinking about as you were reading the paper we handed out, maybe looked at some other material. What strikes you today, given the experience in Mali, given what we know happened in Rwanda, in Bosnia, situations where there was some intervention, situations where, for one reason or another, there was none? How do you see those today, and how do we forge a path going forward? Yes, go ahead. Shuyu.
So I'm terrible at history, but I would like to hear your give us some stories. So my question is, does this humanitarian intervention make the country better off afterward? Or is there any example that without humanitarian intervention, the country just helped itself out?
Our friend was saying, can you think of a situation where because of humanitarian intervention, the target country, things got better? And how about an example where there was no intervention, but the country itself confronted the issue and things got better because it addressed the issue on its own without intervention? Is that fair?
Because I'm skeptical about these humanitarian intervention. They're warfare anyway, and I think Americans realized after the Iraqi war it wasn't a good choice, although it's a humanitarian intervention. So.
Right. Well, first let me address the last statement and then try to address your earlier question. Let's say in the last 2 decades, there have been, let's say, 5 or 6 situations where the international community grappled with the question of humanitarian intervention. Rwanda, going back further, Cambodia, East Timor, which was an Indonesian colony, a former Portuguese colony, Bosnia, Mali today, Iraq. Iraq is, of course, given the issue of, it's given it a bad name. Because humanitarian intervention, as I recall, was one of the last reasons the Bush administration invoked after a series of other reasons didn't have credibility. After all, the main reason was weapons of mass destruction. That was the main reason, and that's not humanitarian intervention. That was preemptive war. That was the Bush administration saying, if we don't intervene now, they'll be stronger, they'll have an atomic weapon, and we have to stop them from getting that weapon, a nuclear weapon. So it was not about humanitarian intervention. That was used later when they never found the weapons of mass destruction or even serious stock of chemical weapons, which at one point Saddam Hussein had used on his own people. So from my own point of view, just because you have a bad case, an improper use of this reasoning, does that mean going forward you can never do it again? And I think, although I'm trying to stay neutral on this question, but I don't think you can use this one example as a way to say, never again shall we intervene. I mean, why give a free check, a blank check, to autocrats, to dictators, because things went wrong in Iraq? I think you have to face that. Yes, they went wrong, but it doesn't mean going forward, therefore, the world can never intervene again. After all, the intervention in Libya did work out well. Generally considered to have been successful. Is Libya a functioning, stable democracy now? No. Would it be a functioning, stable democracy today if he were still in power, if Gaddafi were still in power? Of course not. And is it going to take a while for Libya to sort it out? Regrettably, yes. I think the general consensus is that still it was worth the intervention. And from the U.S. point of view, we didn't send soldiers on the ground. It was, purely an intervention with air power, which can't work in a lot of situations, but seems to have been effective in that situation. So it was a combination of domestic forces that, after all, took the initiative initially, and then European and American intervention that, in that combination, brought an end to the Gaddafi regime. So I think that was a form of humanitarian intervention. I think you could say that that worked. Is it perfect? Well, Libya is not Bermuda yet. Right? It's not even Mississippi. But if you know what I mean. It's not perfect, but it's without Gaddafi. But I think these are going to be, and these will always be the factors. I mean, the logic attached to humanitarian intervention becomes very, very twisted. The Bush administration used the example of the U.S. defeat of both Japan and Nazi Germany as a way to say, we not only can defeat, how Bush used to talk, the bad guys, but we can occupy a country and turn that country into a democracy. And he gave his examples, Japan and Nazi Germany. But we didn't intervene there as an act of humanitarian intervention. We were attacked. The U.S. was not going to get involved in the war in the Pacific until the Japan attacked. How many of you know why we went to war with Germany? Does anyone know the answer? Pearl Harbor was an attack by Japan. Why did we then go to war against Germany?
I may have my history class, but I think it was a Zimmerman note involved.
No, that's World War I. We went to war with Germany because Germany then declared war on the United States the next day. So they did Roosevelt a favor. Of course, Roosevelt was probably waiting to get into the war, to help England, to defeat Nazi Germany, etc. And the Pearl Harbor, obviously, the U.S. immediately went to war, and then Germany declared war on the United States. So we're at war with Germany. Just think back, what would it have been like on this, Pearl Harbor's December 7th? What would it have been like for Roosevelt to say, okay, we will now, we're at war with Japan, and Japan is allied with Germany, therefore we will now get involved in the European war. It may seem easy to make that logic today, but it was Hitler who declared war on the United States. So Roosevelt, that question was settled. There was a lot of, feeling in the United States not to get involved in the war. A lot of feeling. The Zimmermann telegram was from early 1917, when the Germans cooked up this crazy idea of encouraging Mexico to declare war on the United States, and in return Mexico would get back parts of the southeast United States, should they win the war. And then this was divulged, and on top of other things happening, Wilson then, the United States entered World War I in the final year and a half of the conflict. But until early 1917, the United States was neutral. It was totally neutral, and there was a lot of feeling to stay out of the war altogether. Yeah, go ahead.
So would you say, despite the name that suggests that its main goal is the humanitarian protection, it sounds like ultimately what decides intervention, which cases to intervene or not, is mostly driven by international political interests. So would you say humanitarian protection is then just a byproduct, more like a justification of the intervention rather than its main goal? And my second question is that these factors are easy to consider when we decide either to intervene or not, but how do we decide when to pull out the forces? I was wondering how much the humanitarian interests decide when to end.
Yes. Well, those are two very important questions. I don't think you're being cynical when you ask, is the motivation really humanitarian, or is that the gloss? Is that the public reason, whereas the real reason is natural resources or some other political consideration or saving face? Countries go to war to save face sometimes. I don't know why, but we see that, right? And that's why certainly one of the reasons, of the, let's say, legitimate reasons to decide to intervene is, what is the real motive? And you have to challenge a government that is considering intervening, even in the face of a very bad situation, let's say like Darfur. To pick one, are there ulterior motives involved? I think that's always a good question. And the answer may be, no, there aren't. The answer may be, there are no ulterior motives. And if in fact we can demonstrate there are no ulterior motives, no compelling ulterior motives, let's put it that way, no substantial ulterior motives, it really is humanitarian, then that's an important factor to recognize. But a government, I think any government, has to demonstrate that that's the case, and has to be prepared to answer that very realistic and cynical question. What do you really want to do here? Why do you really want to intervene? Because governments give all kinds of public reasons. But then underneath, there could be all other kinds of motives and reasoning. We, in the 1960s and 70s, and all the debates over Vietnam, the U.S. government gave all kinds of reasons why the U.S. needed to intervene. And then the Pentagon Papers came out, which divulged all their interior discussions in the White House, in the State Department. And let's just say there was not a complete overlap between what President Johnson and President Nixon were saying to the American people and then what was being discussed inside these institutions. It wasn't the same thing. So it's absolutely right. We have to ask, is it really for humanitarian reasons? And I think we can say there will be many situations where the humanitarian reasons cry out to be addressed, but there could still be other reasons for doing it. In other words, we haven't mentioned Haiti today. Haiti endured this terrible earthquake. If you've been reading the news, you know that billions and billions of dollars in aid have gone into Haiti for very little effect. Very little effect. Major articles in the New York Times and elsewhere about this. Because where are the hospitals? Where are the roads? Where are the built, homes for people with all that money? Where's it gone? Well, find the history of Haiti. How many times has the U.S. intervened? The poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. How many times have we intervened? I think we occupied Haiti for 3 decades at one point in the 20th century. I'm sure we said it was for humanitarian reasons. Well, how's that worked out? So, now your other question was, when do we get out? And this relates to the issue of, do you have a reasonable prospect for a good outcome once you've intervened? What does that outcome look like? What's the country going to look like? Will it have a stable government of its own? Or at least a reasonable government that's being imposed? I mean, one could say when it comes to Japan, we fought a terrible war. We dropped 2 atomic bombs. But in the end, the occupation, U.S. occupation, set the foundation for a democratic and prosperous Japan. Once the war was over. I'm not a close his student. I'm sure there are a lot of very legitimate and tough questions to ask. But the fact is that Japan is a member of the Democratic Community of Nations. It's quite prosperous. And it recovered from that terrible war. And the U.S. occupation contributed to that. Just as the occupation of Germany in the Western sectors contributed to the establishment of a democratic, very prosperous, very stable federal republic. And there was another occupation in the smaller eastern zone of Germany, the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, that was just another dictatorship. And you could look at the history of these 2 occupations. So if the goal is, once you've intervened, to stay long enough to engage in some degree of nation building, which is probably what you have to do, what are the prospects for success and how much are you going to end up spending? And those are also legitimate questions. But do you invoke that question in order to prevent the intervention, or to simply say we still need to intervene, but we know it's going to be tough getting out, but we have to save these victims? That's the logic, after all. But the idea, I think it's very easy to pick on the Bush administration, but this is something all governments have faced. It's always easy to get in. It's always easy to start a war. But you have no idea where it will take you. No idea. One of our students today made reference to the Zimmerman telegram in World War I. All the powers that got involved in World War I in 1914 assumed it would be over in a few months. That was their assumption. Based on all their reasoning, all their armaments, all their experience, and they were wrong. Doesn't even begin to explain the tragedy. So you have no idea what you'll get into once you start a war, or you decide to intervene. Witness Iraq. Again, it's very easy to pick on the Bush administration, but or that the Iraqis were going to welcome us with open arms, or that we wouldn't have to spend any money, that we will get their oil revenue and that would cover the cost. It was a very famous claim by the Bush administration. I don't think we've seen a dime from Iraqi oil revenues to cover the costs of the intervention. Well, that's just another, on the negative side, let's say. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. I'm more interested in the human rights aspect of
Sure.
what you spoke about today. So as we begin to research our various regions, our hotspots, I'm focusing more on North Korea, and I'm interested in the human rights and the healthcare there. I actually read an article a few days ago about Amnesty International when they reported really candid perspectives of I think there were defectors who left North Korea about the healthcare system and the human rights there. So how do you propose that we even begin to address human rights issues in countries like North Korea as we're trying to find solutions for issues like that and we're coming up against really hard walls? Can you please just speak about, that aspect
Well,
of countries?
you've picked probably the most extreme example. But even North Korea has experienced some change after all. Not the kind of change maybe the government had in mind, but for the first time in the recent years, refugees have been leaving, not easily, not with the cooperation of the government, but they've been leaving. It's given us a much better idea of what life is like in North Korea. And I think that has created some pressure on the North Koreans as well. Just recently, we saw the visit of the executive chairman of Google, Eric Schmidt, and former governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson, were there. It's not a major step, but it's curious that they would go and the government would welcome them. From my own point of view, anything that would lessen North Korea's isolation, anything that would open it up to any degree to contact with the wider world could only be helpful. Only be helpful. Obviously, you're dealing with one of the most repressive governments in the world. Amnesty estimates there could be 250,000, I believe I've seen that figure, 250,000 prisoners in its gulag, a word we borrowed from Soviet Union. But it also illustrates the limits of our ability to affect change, to use that phrase. It's armed to the teeth. It already fought a terrible war 60 years ago with the South and with the UN. Remember, there was a UN intervention authorized by the General Assembly, which infuriated the Soviets because we couldn't get the authorization from the Security Council, so they went to the General Assembly, which you couldn't do now. And so there was the U.S. went in as part of a UN force. I think my bottom line in thinking about North Korea is that any opportunity there is for people to visit, for officials to visit, to try to diffuse the tensions, to avoid war as best, obviously, as possible. South Korea is tremendously prosperous. It doesn't need a war with North Korea. But this will only affect change in the long, long run. And if China would ever get interested in human rights, I know that you have a session with Mr. Paulson and Mrs. Albright later in the month on China. And, I wonder if when we discuss China and China's growth domestically, or we discuss human rights, you always think about discussing human rights internal to China. But what about China's role in the world? If we think about our discussion today as humanitarian intervention, well, what about anti-humanitarian intervention? What is China's role in Sudan today? It's the major supplier of arms and client of Sudan for oil. What is China's role in the rest of Africa, even in Latin America today? We debate, we Americans, in my lifetime, we've had terrible debates. The flip side of humanitarian intervention is when you intervene for malicious reasons, right? That's the flip side. So we've had terrible debates about what is U.S. role in Central America, what about Vietnam, what about U.S. response to apartheid or support for the apartheid regime. and a host of these issues. We debate up and down. Where is the debate in China about China's relationship with North Korea? Or Myanmar? Or Sudan? Where's the debate inside China about China's role in the world? Not just as a trading partner, but its role in the Security Council. Because when the U.S. gets involved, there's people in Congress or Amnesty International or all kinds of NGOs that raise questions about what is the U.S. doing in fill in the blank, right? All the time. Well, that's part of our system. Well, China is playing an enormous role in the world today, economically and politically. And there is no debate about human rights. When China gets involved in economic development or materials extraction, almost in a classic colonial way in Africa, is someone inside China saying, what about human rights? China doesn't care. It doesn't care. And the U.S., when the U.S. gets involved, at least it has to discuss it because it's all over the papers. People are marching. There are hearings in Congress. You know, that's what happens here. In China, there's no debate. So I would hope that when all of you discuss China and continue to discuss China, ask about China's role in the world. As there's humanitarian intervention, but there's malicious intervention. Okay, you go ahead.
Thank you. You mentioned Rwanda and Mali. So I was wondering if you could speak as in your capacity as someone who works for Amnesty International.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on former colonial powers acting in their former colonies for humanitarian?
Well, this is very complicated, and frankly, there is simply no easy formula. Answer. On the one hand, and the classic example is West Africa, Francophone Africa with France. There are some very sad cases of French intervention in Africa for really malicious purposes and malicious ends. In other words, look at the relationship, I believe it was Giscard was the president, Giscard d'Estaing in France, when Bokassa was head of the Central African Empire. And it turns out they were fronting for him, they were giving him enormous gifts. Well, that's a form of intervention, isn't it? In a way. So the French have not always played the role of defending democratic values in their former colonies. Which is sad because France itself is a democratic country. And if you look at the foreign policy, particularly of Mitterrand, also, who was a socialist, it's very disheartening. Which is part of adds to the complexity of French intervention in Mali today. But I think it's just too early. Frankly, if it succeeds, we'll congratulate them. If it doesn't succeed, for whatever reason, either they don't stay long enough, or they don't use enough force, or the Al-Qaeda people are too strong, or the Malians don't help out, it'll be seen as a failure. And if it fails, then we'll question their motives. But if it succeeds, they'll be applauded. But I think the question of France's intervention in what had been its colonial states has always been very checkered. Very checkered. And that's why sometimes these are the last states. They're the last states to intervene, but on the other hand, for some reason there's a feeling that they're the natural candidate. Because of language, because of culture, because they tend to know the region. But, after all, we live in the United States, which broke away from a colonial power. And the British did intervene here. And there was a question of British intervention during our Civil War, which they decided not to do. So I think these are sensitive questions that Americans should be aware of. I don't know, where do I begin? Okay, on this side. You had the microphone already. So.
So I was wondering, what is your take on the thousands of civilians killed in the acts of war crime in Afghanistan? Because in Afghanistan?
Afghanistan,
yes, because I recall Amnesty International condemned those acts, but there weren't any serious efforts undertaken to stop those, or were there any serious efforts
Now,
undertaken?
these are the killings by Taliban?
No, by the U.S. troops, like there.
Yeah. Well, this is the downside, of course, of intervention, that once you decide to intervene and you use force and you blow up buildings, that you have all this, pardon the expression, collateral damage, which is another one of these very graceful euphemisms for killing people. And you see it played out now with this drone warfare in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Yemen, and other places. That the president, and it's the president's decision to use these weapons, knowing that from time to time, innocent people, and we admit they're innocent, they were not being targeted deliberately, will be hurt or killed. And, the Israelis face this with some of their attacks in Gaza, obviously, and elsewhere. I think the British faced it in response to violence in Northern Ireland, even when that violence was played out elsewhere in Europe. But in Afghanistan, it's on a very big scale. It's on a very big scale. And it's provoked tremendous amount of bad feeling among the Afghan people, which is another reason why I think we're getting out. I don't think that will mean the end of American intervention, because you can get out and you can still intervene. That's the beauty of drones, right? So you can be sitting in a room on an Air Force base anywhere in the world, on land or sea, and operating these weapons. And they're not so surgical. Not so surgical. So I know Amnesty has condemned, the fact that this war in Afghanistan has resulted in the deaths of so many civilians, but that's modern war too today. We just look at World War I versus World War II and the proportion of civilians killed in each conflict. It's vastly increased, vastly increased. Because of air power. It's not armies facing each other in the field anymore. That's not what war is. Okay, this side, go ahead. In the green jacket.
Hi, my name is Sundus. So you talked about humanitarian intervention and being to stop human rights violation in other countries. But what about the case of a conflict between two countries, like what happened 2 months ago between Gaza and Israel, where a lot of Palestinians' casualties much more than the Israeli?
Yes.
How does the international community react to that? And how does foreign policy play into humanitarian intervention or not?
Well, if our discussion today is humanitarian intervention, the fact is that you're never going to have humanitarian intervention invoked in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian or the Israeli-Arab conflict. It's just not going to happen. There's not going to be any intervention to protect Palestinians. There's not going to be humanitarian intervention between Gaza and Israel. Unfortunately, both sides have access to the weapons it feels it needs. There's not going to be a boycott. The U.S. is not going to invoke its own laws that do apply for various political reasons. It's just unfortunately not going to happen. I do think both, Amnesty's attitude, whether it's this now second conflict in a few years between Israel and Gaza, or Israel and Lebanon to the north with Hezbollah, is that when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. And unfortunately, in this disheartening conflict, each round gets to be more destructive. So, there are maps that show you how the rocket fire out of Gaza creeps more and more into Israel. It's not just being able to reach Sderot in the Negev, but Beersheba. And the Israelis respond with a lot of force, obviously. And should the militias or Hamas in Gaza decide that it has within its range to attack Dimona. Do you know what Dimona is? Anyone know what Dimona is? Dimona is the Israeli nuclear reactor site in the Negev, which is not so far out of range of rockets out of Gaza, and neither is Ben Gurion Airport. So should the rocket fire out of Gaza be targeted toward Dimona or Ben Gurion Airport, then what we've seen so far is child's play, because the Israelis will not tolerate that. They can't. So the situation cries out for some kind of settlement. That's easy for me to say. And it's not going to be imposed by any outside power, because neither side will allow it. And there isn't the will or the capacity, I suppose, to enforce it. So that's my sober, hopeless analysis. But each round of fighting gets worse. The range of the rockets out of Gaza gets longer. And the political figures involved also become more extreme. So if it took the Israelis decades to deal with the PLO, which it's happy to deal with Fatah and the PLO now, it won't deal with Hamas. And there'll be a time when Hamas is superseded by an even more extreme group, if this isn't settled, like Al-Qaeda. So I suppose if one really wanted to be cynical, we can look forward to the time when the Israelis wish they were dealing with Hamas. Yes. In the second row, go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. What solutions do you have to ensure that political tensions do not prevent humanitarian interventions or the declaration of the right to protect? And an example I have in mind is Syria.
Yeah, what was the first phrase? What
solutions do you have in mind to ensure that political tensions do not prevent humanitarian interventions or the right to protect?
Well, there is no guarantee. It's always politics. And I don't say that cynically or that it's not legitimate. It's perfectly legitimate. Syria isn't the same as Libya. The facts on the ground are not the same. The capacity of the Syrian army is not the same as the Libyan army. The possibility of of affecting other countries because of this conflict in Syria is far greater than it was with Libya. The Arab world was fed up with Gaddafi. They were embarrassed by Gaddafi. They were happy to see him go. The Syrian government is seen differently. I don't think from a moral point of view it's any different, but it's seen differently. You've had now fighting with Turkey, which is part of NATO. You've had the overflow of refugees into Jordan. You've had conflicts with Israel and the Golan. It's a far more volatile situation. And the possibility of Syria breaking up in the wake of the collapse, should it come, of the Assad regime, and of interethnic fighting within Syria. None of that is said out of any regard for the Assad regime, which is obviously brutal. And, people say, well, at some point Assad lost his legitimacy. I never understood what legitimacy they had in the first place. What legitimacy any dictatorship has. In other words, I certainly recognize they're in charge, so you deal with them. That's their legitimacy. But where I come from, your legitimacy as a government is derived from a free election, from a contested election. That's the base of your legitimacy. I don't see how a dictatorship can claim legitimacy. It claims it has the authority and the force to govern, to rule a given country. Is that the same as legitimacy? In the international system, that's seen as the legitimate government, meaning the governing government, the ruling government. Everyone's grappling with what to do in Syria now. The bottom line is, A, help the refugees and make sure with winter upon the Middle East that they're having what they need. Help Turkey, which is bearing the brunt of it. Don't let Jordan become even more destabilized because of it. And then the question will arise, what kind of weapons to supply to the opposition? Now, I'm sure that's what our government and other governments are and have been considering for many, many months. But this is not going to have a very happy ending. I can't imagine it will in Syria, because the longer it goes on, the likelihood of violence between communities is greater. There's even talk now of the Alawites and the Assad regime retreating to some enclave on the coast as a kind of final, resort. I don't mean resort meaning vacation homes. And then the rest of the country would be controlled by the opposition. But that is already suggesting partition of some kind. And how long could that last? So the fact is that these regimes have been in power for so long, decades and decades. Egypt, Syria, should change over, come to Saudi Arabia, what's that going to look like? This is what happens when you allow, or at least watch, a dictatorship go on and on and on, and there are never any institutions created to succeed that dictatorship. You see that in Egypt today. Without some kind of institutions, what can succeed a dictatorship? One of the big criticisms of the Clinton administration in Russia, to go to a different part of the world, is they dealt with Yeltsin, but they didn't develop any democracy. So Putin picked up the pieces. And there was no institutional counterweight to a strong president, an assertive president. And so you have more or less a fake parliament and more or less fake elections. But I'm throwing in another, but you can see how Syria, how's that going to turn into something constructive? How? What kind of consensus can emerge once the Assad regime collapses? And it will, of course it will. So I don't know what kind of solution there will be.
And I'm afraid on that note. but Jack, I want to thank you for all this. Really, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.